Yeah. I'm going to be speaking in English because Danny Kaufman, we just have to be fair. He's on the other side. He's still listening to us. And he doesn't have the ability to neither understand, speak, or somebody next to him to translate him. I just lost the clipper. What I'm going to say. So I'm commenting on the great earlier two messages that Gary Reed and Danny Kaufman mentioned. They're basically one very big important message. If you really want to go through a very serious, long-term, deep solvency crisis, which is what we are going through, this is not a short-term liquidity crisis we're going through. This is a very long-term and deep solvency crisis. The answer is not just look at the short-term macro adjustments. They're important, but they're short-term. What you really need to look into is institutions, institutions, institutions. Institutions, institutions, and institutions. And of course, I'm an institutional economist, so I'm going to be beating my own drum. But here we go. This is what is basically the conclusion to most of our examples and our experiences in other countries. My 18 years of experience in putting together economic theory into practice, in studying informality, in studying exactly why we have a deficit, not really of the current account alone or the balance of payments alone, but really a deficit of trust. The only way you can mend that deficit of trust is through institutions. Very interesting institutional reform, as a matter of fact. Now, what is very interesting to point out is that we do make the confusion of engaging or of identifying institutions and organizations as the same term. Organizations are tools that apply agreements. Institutions are agreements. Agreements that allow transactions to take place. So there is a lack of trust in an economy. There is no growth. Why? Because people do not trust to transact among themselves. They do not trust to transact with the state. The state does not trust to transact with them. Does that remind you something kind of like very close to us? Probably Greece right now. So I'm going to be, I was rather impressed with the fact that in a very good and succinct way, we found out that if you don't have evidence of your reform, you can't lose your people. Do you hear me? You lose your people. In other words, it's good to go around and say that it's important to do institutional reforms. But it's good to say it and then just immediately show that you do something about it. So what I'm going to do right now, otherwise you lose confidence. People will not want to listen to you anymore. I'm going to be telling you my few little PowerPoints, because I don't want to be too long, that it's not just Greece's problem, but Greece is the first one that has shown this problem of deficit in trust. I have spent the last 2 years working in analyzing the informal element in the Greek economy, and I did it in the area of labor markets and in the area of property markets. So that it would be interesting for us to see. I'm going to give you a very brief, sneak preview of what came out of that. What came out of that is, this is a map of a sale process of property in Greece. I am absolutely positive that all of you, I look at it, oh, you're great, you're wonderful. No words. All of us have gone through this. We are the only one of the biggest property ownership is one of the highest indicators in Greece, right? So all of us really know the headache of actually having to purchase a piece of land or an apartment or a house. What is very interesting to see here, it's what also Danny mentioned earlier. It is a system that is captured, in this case, by two major professions, lawyers and notary publics. It is taking 15 entities. It's 15 agencies an individual has to go through to complete a sale. The steps that one has to go through are 17 if you have no problem, and 27 if you have a problem. Why? Because the problem means that you have to go back and re-establish and correct some of your licenses. The time required is 1 to 6 months. Now, when I count the time required, I count days without including Saturdays, Sundays, national holidays. So let's say you have nothing to do, but you spend 9 hours a day, 7 to 9 hours a day working. And then legal systems we're dealing with, I'm writing here there are two, there are actually three. It's the notarial book, it's the hypothekofylakio, which we call it the deed system, and then the cadastral office, which is the title system, which we call timatologio. All three systems are operating in parallel. It's a fantastic case study. All three systems operate in parallel. All three systems are going against each other. And who is really talking about privatizing public land and public property? All right, so how should it really look? We're bright, we're smart, we're Greeks. We should know that, right? Simplicity. Where is Mr. Manos? Manos is the extraordinary man. He always talks about simplicity. Okay, so usually we have 5 steps in Rolls-Royce step world. What does that mean? You have a buyer, a seller, they agree, they want to buy a piece of property. The buyer needs to clarify whether that belongs to the seller. So the buyer should go to the registry. Hello? The registry should only be one type of a system, not the 3 I just mentioned. Just identifies that indeed it's this person's land, is the seller's land, purchase of property, whatever. So they go to a lawyer. In other cases, there are some countries you can go to the registry's lawyer within the registry. You don't move out of that office. You're sitting there. You structure the contract. You register the contract. You're out of there. Your contract is already yours. Your land belongs to you. Okay? And what is interesting, though, is I'm going to make you happier now, because you're going to see we're not the only country that is that bad. Okay, so in the doing business indicators, registering property, the red bar is Greece. Out of 180 countries, we rank 150. And the yellow ones are the European Union countries, and the rest are, I just picked up countries around the world. So the Philippines, I love the Philippines, and I always have it as a good indicator because it's a little bit as messy as Greece. The Philippines is 117 out of 180 countries. What is interesting is, however, to see France and Belgium. France ranks 149, just one little step below Greece, and Belgium ranks 174. Do you know why this is the case? We have copied the French legal system. That gives you the answer. We have copied the French legal system, which was the system of the deux, right? Deux, he bought the deux, they say. Well, at the time of the countries were all organized by the power the land had. So you were not supposed to, the law was making it really difficult for you to split your land or sell your land or do anything you wanted to do with your land. No, you were not supposed to do anything with your land because it was mercantilism. You were not supposed to sell. So the law was making it really hard. When we became our own country in 1830s, we completely imported the legal system of France. All African nations and all Latin American nations that have done the same thing have the exact same problem. In Peru, the system was very similar, as well as in Argentina, as well as in Venezuela. It's actually even worse. Okay, now, when we go now to the labor force, the assessment of the labor force, prima facie, you get to understand, you notice, you think that there is not much informality in the labor force. Why? Because total labor force right here is 5,257,54, how many, people that work, 5,200,000 and something. Out of which 4,237,000 are already enlisted in the Social Security, the ICA. And then if you add up the population that is somewhere outside is only 200,000, and not enlisted at ICA is 188,000. So yes, we have not enlisted labor force, but come on, not enlisted labor force, it's completely under the norm, if you ask me. I've seen it in other countries. This not enlisted labor force, it's rather okay. But is this the problem of Greece? Is informality in Greece, and that's the big, big mistake we all make, is informality in Greece those that are not enlisted, adiloti, and those that are enlisted? Absolutely not. Of course. Why should that be the answer? This would have been too easy. Our problem is that we have semi-reported employment. And we all know it. We get paid 2,000 euros a month. 1,000 is reported, and the other 1,000 is under the table. So take the equation and continue it. If you get only reported 1,000 euros, then of course you will also going to pay Social Security, your portion for 1,000 euros, and the employer's portion for 1,000 euros. What is interesting to see is that because there is very high cost on the labor side, in other words, about 50% of the wage is labor taxes, labor costs, frictions, all these things. All of you who have employees, you know what I'm talking about. But it works interestingly. The incentive is so negative, the incentive is negative. Does it make sense what I'm saying? I know it makes sense, but I'm just trying to make it make sense in the Greek world. When you have a negative incentive, it means that it is it is to the benefit of both parties to not comply. All right? So there is nothing here. All these talk about capitalism is bad or politics are terrible and the ideology. Let me tell you, the Greek world has figured it out on their own outside, which is what I call the informal economy, very well how to handle it. The law is the legal capture that Daniel Kaufman was mentioning is very clear here. So why does an employer and an employee agree to have underreporting? Because it's beneficial to both of them. Because one is going to pay less taxes, and the other one is anyway receiving very bad services in ICA, right? So why would he want to be taxed additionally by paying his additional reported tax to ICA? No. He's anyway either going to have to go to a private doctor when he gets sick, fly to London if he gets sick. It was very common. I don't know if it's still common. Sometimes, I don't know if we still do it, bribe a doctor or a nurse to take care of him in a public hospital. So why should he pay twice? So he chooses to pay once. Now, the results to this, sticky labor works, sticky labor costs. It's very difficult to change this world. And it was interesting to listen before to Dora Bakoyani and Luca Cazzelli, where they were both saying the same thing. They were basically both saying, it's not possible to change this. That's what they were saying, for whatever reason. And that's what generates lack of trust. So I'm going back to my original premise. And that's what generates lack of trust to the political parties on top of it, my original premise. Now, when you go to the newly hired, right now, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, newly hired, here is where you go and find out that you have αδήλωτη εργασία. 45% of women are only insured by their employees, and 55% of men are only insured by the employees. And that's why you have a very quick turnover in the private sector. So in the private sector, that's why also Greek private sector is usually 5 to 10 employees. It's like small and medium enterprise. 98% of the private sector is small and medium employees. They can turn them around very quickly. They don't have to report them. So this is just to show you that when you, of course, have, what is the impact, right? What is the impact? We're doing all these reforms to the Social Security. We're doing all these reforms to the pension system, right? But then, since 2006, it's very significant. It's rather interesting. Since 2006, informal force is increasing. The amount of non-reporting is increasing. And then, obviously, the contribution to the Social Security is being decreased as well. You notice also that from 99, you have a bit of a reduction of the registered workforce, but from 2006, non-registered workforce is increasing as well. So something happened in 2006, and people started to not be listening, not reporting their employees, and employees also not reporting their employment. And again, these are my last two slides. When you go to the starting business, and that's why I think it's really important to understand that structural reforms are, of course, a super important Greek reform program, and we have to take care of it, and we have to do it. But it's not alone, and because we belong to the Eurozone, this is a reform that needs also to take place in the rest of the European Union. So, starting a business, we've talked so much in the last 2 years, I'm sure you heard, it's so hard to start a business in Greece. We used to rank 142, I believe, out of 180 countries. Now we rank 130. Luca Cazzelli created that one-stop shop, and it kind of helped a bit, right? But we're still 140, 135, okay? Not very good, especially if you're in New Zealand and you're ranked #1 in the world. Okay, now, if you are Spain or Austria, two countries that belong to the Eurozone, how hard is it to start a business in Spain or Austria? They rank 133 and 134. Why people prefer to go there than to come here? It's because their labor laws are probably better, and it's because the environment is easier to do business there in general. And then here again, the ease of doing business in general. You see, that's why I had this, so we can see the comparison. Greece ranks 100 out of 180 countries, and God bless the Philippines, 136, right? They're much worse. But then you go back again to Spain, which is 44, Austria 32, France 29, and Belgium 28. So although they have these singled out problems that I showed you earlier, in overall, the other countries are better off in doing business than we are in a holistic manner. That's why it's more important, that's why the crisis has hurt us first and foremost, and that's why we really need to go to further deep structural reforms. Now, does it work? Yeah. So here it is. I'm going to sum up everything, and I'm going to say that what is super important is to put what we say in the United States, your money where your words is, where your mouth is. Yeah. So you do need to have reform appetite. It's not enough for some political leader to say, I have the political will to do something. You just have to have the reform appetite. And what does a reform appetite mean? It means that you first have to diagnose correctly informality. In each country, informality is different. It comes in different shapes and forms, but you have to identify it and diagnose it. I have a method to do it. You can find your own method. Identify it, though, please. Second is you need to have a serious strategy that will be building trust. If your strategy does not build trust, and if you have reduction of confidence, you failed in your institutional reform program. And what would the strategy be made of? It would be made of a very strong reform team, a strong reform team, not a team that doesn't engage and doesn't really know. The reform team has to have a very serious vision, has to be convinced, has to have the appetite. No U-turning. Thank God for Mrs. Thatcher. She taught us not to U-turn, right? Not U-turning. You can't just say, yes, I'm going to go this way, and then you're changing your brain and your mind in another way. You know, imagine that you're on a plane, and you have a ticket, and that plane goes to LA. Imagine if the pilot changes his mind and says, oh, well, we're going to end up in Kansas now. It's interesting to get this type of visuals because that shows how absurd it is to change your mind about such important reforms that actually talk about the survival and sustainability of economic growth of a country of 10 million people. All right, measurable results is exactly what Gary was talking about. The evidence, you really need to show evidence, and that builds up in trust. And continuous awareness to the citizens. Citizens need to know all the time where you are, what you do, why you're doing what you're doing. You don't have to be there and telling them every single detail, but part of your strategy should be to present to your audience truthful information in favor and against a specific measure. And then, of course, prioritize reforms. I would always start with tax administration reform and then continue with judiciary, registries, which is my deal because if you don't have good registries, you can't value properties, you cannot value companies, you cannot do very much. And basically, you need to also do the similar type of reforms on civil service, budget, and services. And these are my points. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. We are out of time, but we could perhaps take one or two comments or questions if anybody is burning to have them. I thought all three of those were very interesting and very pertinent to Greece. Well, it's been a long morning. Fine. Well, I'm not sure I have a question particularly. I mean, I suppose my thought, which is not really for any of you to comment on, is simply that the process is going to take a long time. Yeah. You all said that. And the political and social challenge is keeping going during that period. And I see that as very, very difficult for Greece and indeed